October 1969. A taxi moves slowly through the fog-covered streets of San Francisco. The driver has no idea that the passenger sitting behind him is about to become one of the most mysterious killers in American history. A few minutes later, a gunshot echoes through the night. The driver collapses over the steering wheel. But the strangest part is not the murder itself. It's what happens afterward. The killer calmly steps out of the cab. He doesn't run. He doesn't panic. Instead, he carefully wipes away evidence, cuts a piece of the victim's shirt as a trophy, and disappears into the darkness. Only minutes later, police arrive, and they make what may become one of the most costly mistakes in American criminal investigations. They see the suspect. They speak to the suspect, and then they let him walk away. Over the following years, America will become obsessed with strange letters, unsolved ciphers, and a series of attacks that seem to follow no clear pattern. The killer gives himself a name that terrifies an entire nation: Zodiac. And more than half a century later, nobody knows for certain who he really was, before the name Zodiac appeared on newspaper front pages. Before mysterious letters sent an entire nation into panic. Everything began on what seemed like an ordinary night, a night when two teenagers believed they were starting a new chapter in their lives. Ethan was 17 years old. Claire was 16. They had met only a few months earlier and had quickly become inseparable. That evening, they told their families they were going to a concert. Instead, they drove to a quiet area just outside town, a place popular with young couples looking for privacy away from parents and neighbors. The sky was dark. The road was nearly empty. Everything felt peaceful until headlights appeared behind them. Another vehicle slowly approached. It pulled up right beside Ethan's car. For the first few seconds, nothing seemed unusual. Maybe it was another driver looking for a place to park. Maybe it was another couple. Then, the gunshots began. Glass exploded. Metal rattled under the impact of bullets. Everything happened in an instant. Ethan tried to open the door. Claire ran into the darkness in panic. They both tried to escape, but the stranger was faster, more ruthless, and seemingly prepared for every move they made. Only minutes later, silence returned. The road became quiet once again, as if nothing had happened. No witnesses, no motive, no suspect, only a bloody crime scene and a growing list of unanswered questions. When police arrived, they believed they were dealing with a single tragic incident, a random act of violence, an isolated crime. They had no idea they had just witnessed the opening chapter of a nightmare that would last for decades. Because the man responsible was not finished. In fact, he was only getting started. For months after that attack, investigators had almost nothing to work with. No fingerprints, no reliable suspects, no solid leads worth pursuing. Slowly, the case began to fade into the background. Then, another attack happened. This time, the victims were Rachel and her friend, Kevin. It was a holiday weekend. Music filled the town. Fireworks lit up the night sky. People were celebrating. No one knew that somewhere in the darkness, someone was hunting for another victim. Rachel and Kevin drove to a quiet parking area on the edge of town. It was isolated, peaceful, and perfect for someone who wanted to act unseen. At first, they noticed a car following them. Rachel changed directions. The vehicle stayed behind them. Then suddenly, it disappeared. For a moment, they believed the danger was gone. But only minutes later, the car returned. This time, it stopped directly behind them. A man stepped out. A bright light shined into the vehicle. For a brief moment, Kevin thought it was a police officer. Maybe it was a routine check. Maybe they were simply being told to leave. Then, the gunshots started. Again. No warning. No conversation. No chance to escape. When police received the first emergency call, they still didn't understand what they were dealing with. But only minutes later, another phone call came in. The caller sounded calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. He described the crime scene perfectly. He described the victims perfectly. Then he admitted something that sent a chill through investigators. He claimed responsibility not only for the attack that night, but also for the murders months earlier. That was the moment everything changed, because for the first time, police realized they were not hunting an ordinary killer. They were hunting someone who wanted to be known, someone who wanted attention. And perhaps the most terrifying part? He seemed to be enjoying it. By the way, if you had been an investigator at that moment, would you have believed the mysterious caller immediately? Or assumed he was just another attention seeker? A few weeks later, 3 major newspapers across the region received nearly identical envelopes. There was nothing unusual about them at first glance. No return address, no sender's name, no clue about who had mailed them. But inside was something that would send California into panic. The letter opened with a chilling declaration. The writer claimed responsibility for the recent attacks. But that wasn't all. He included details that had never been released to the public. Details that only the killer or the police could have known. The editors were stunned. Yet the most disturbing part came afterward. Attached to the letter was a strange collection of symbols. Hundreds of characters arranged in neat rows. No words, no sentences, just a maze of seemingly meaningless symbols. The writer claimed that his identity was hidden inside. And if the newspapers refused to publish the cipher, more people would die. Suddenly, the question was no longer who committed the murders. The question became, should the media cooperate with the killer? If they published the cipher, they might help investigators identify him, but they might also be giving him exactly what he wanted: attention, recognition, fear. In the end, the newspapers decided to publish the entire message. And it may have been the most important decision in the entire case, because the moment those symbols appeared before the public, an unknown murderer became a legend. A name began spreading across America. People talked about him in schools, in offices, in coffee shops, and on television, which was exactly what he wanted. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted the world to look at him, to remember him, to make him the main character of his own story. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it seemed to be working. While police continued chasing every possible lead, something unexpected happened. The first cipher was not solved by the FBI, not by the CIA, and not by any government cryptography expert. Instead, it was solved by an ordinary married couple. They weren't investigators. They weren't scientists. They were simply 2 people fascinated by puzzles. After spending days at their dining room table with pencils, paper, and endless theories, they began to see the first words emerge, then the first sentences, and eventually, the entire message revealed itself. But instead of exposing the killer's identity, the contents were even more disturbing. The writer said he enjoyed killing people. He described murder as entertainment, as something more exciting than anything else in life. Yet the most alarming part came near the end. The killer claimed that when he died, he would be reborn into another existence, and every person he had murdered would become his servant in the afterlife. These were not the words of a criminal trying to escape justice. They were the words of someone who genuinely believed what he was saying, someone who felt no guilt, no remorse, and no fear of death. At that moment, many experts reached a troubling conclusion. If the killer truly believed he would be rewarded after death, there was very little that could intimidate him. Prison would not scare him. Execution would not scare him. Even getting caught might not scare him. And that realization made the hunt far more difficult. Because police were no longer searching for an ordinary murderer. They were searching for someone living inside his own reality. A reality where human lives existed only to serve his twisted fantasies. And, unfortunately, the nightmare was far from over. Then came September, and the killer changed his method. This time there was no car, no dark parking lot, no headlights appearing in the night. Instead, a young couple decided to spend the afternoon by a lake. Ryan and Sophie spread out a picnic blanket on a small peninsula. The setting seemed almost perfect. Calm water, cool air, almost nobody around. But there was something they didn't know. Someone was watching them from a distance, in silence, and with patience. When the man finally appeared, everything immediately felt wrong. He was dressed in black. On his chest was a circular symbol crossed by a white line, the same symbol that had appeared in the mysterious letters. But what caught Ryan's attention most was the long knife in the stranger's hand. The man claimed he only wanted money, a car, a way to leave. For a few brief moments, Ryan believed they might survive, that this was only a robbery. But then, everything changed. The stranger began attacking, again and again. Not with anger, not with panic, but with the cold precision of someone carrying out a plan. When he finally left, he left behind a horrifying scene. Yet the strangest part came afterward, before disappearing. He walked to the victim's vehicle and wrote something on it. Not a threat, not an apology, a record, the dates of previous attacks, and today's date, as if he were keeping score, as if he were a hunter counting trophies. For the first time, investigators understood they were not simply dealing with a murderer. They were dealing with someone who wanted to build a legend around himself, someone who wanted every attack to become another chapter in his story. And the terrifying reality was, that story was far from over. If the killer's goal was to spread fear, he had succeeded. Couples began avoiding isolated locations. Restaurants that were once packed at night suddenly became empty. Parents demanded their children come home before dark. Across Northern California, everyone was talking about the same name, but while the public lived in fear, the killer was preparing his boldest move yet. October 1969. A taxi driver named Daniel was working the night shift. It seemed like an ordinary evening. He picked up passengers, dropped them off, and continued his route until one man stepped into his cab. No one knew that encounter would change the entire investigation. About 15 minutes later, the taxi stopped in a quiet residential neighborhood. Daniel believed the ride was over, but the passenger had other plans. A gunshot echoed through the night. Everything ended within seconds. But this time, the killer made a mistake. Or at least, that's what people believed. Several teenagers watching from a second-floor window witnessed what happened. They immediately called police. They described the suspect, his clothing, his direction of travel. For the first time in the entire case, it seemed investigators were incredibly close, closer than ever before. A patrol car rushed toward the scene. Along the way, 2 officers spotted a man walking through the fog. His build matched, his age matched, his appearance matched, everything matched. But then a mistake happened. An incorrect suspect description had been broadcast over the radio. The officers believed they were searching for someone else, so they asked a few brief questions and drove away. Years later, when the truth became clear, one question began haunting the entire investigation. What if those officers had stopped him for just one more minute? What if they had asked for identification? What if they had decided to hold him for questioning? Could America's greatest criminal mystery have ended that very night? Or would the killer have somehow found a way to disappear once again? After the taxi driver's murder, fear reached a new level. But what frightened people most was not what the killer had already done. It was what he claimed he would do next. Another letter arrived. Inside was a blood-stained piece of fabric cut from the victim's shirt. It was undeniable proof the writer was the murderer. But then the letter took an even darker turn. The killer claimed that children would be his next targets. He talked about attacking school buses, about waiting for terrified children to spill out into the street. For many people, that was the moment Zodiac stopped being just a serial killer. He became a threat to society itself, almost immediately. Police departments across California changed their strategy. School buses were escorted, routes were monitored, armed officers appeared in places where they had never been seen before. Every suspicious phone call was taken seriously. Every threat was investigated. Because nobody knew whether Zodiac was bluffing or planning something real. And that was his greatest weapon. Not the gun, not the knife, but uncertainty. People began looking at strangers differently. A man standing alone by the road became suspicious. A car parked too long became suspicious. Fear started living inside people's minds. And that was exactly what Zodiac wanted, because the more people feared him, the more famous he became. The more people talked about him, the more powerful he felt. Meanwhile, investigators were still struggling with one simple question: who was behind all of this? And, unfortunately, they were still very far from the answer. The years that followed became a maze. Hundreds of suspects emerged and disappeared. Thousands of tips were sent to investigators. Most of them led nowhere. Some believed Zodiac was a former serviceman. Others believed he worked in law enforcement. Some argued he was a cryptographic genius. Others thought he was simply an attention seeker, amplified by the media. Every time a new suspect appeared, hope returned, and then quickly faded away. The fingerprints didn't match. The handwriting didn't match. Witnesses couldn't identify him. The DNA evidence remained inconclusive. The hunt continued, year after year, decade after decade. Investigators retired, witnesses passed away, and much of the evidence slowly disappeared with time. Yet one thing never disappeared: the legend of Zodiac. Because in the end, this is not just a story about a killer. It's a story about how an unknown man forced an entire society to look in his direction. He wasn't the first criminal, and he certainly wasn't the deadliest in history. But he understood something that very few criminals of his era understood. Attention is power. Every letter he mailed, every cipher he created, every threat he wrote, made his story bigger, more famous, more frightening. And in a strange way, that may have been his greatest victory. More than half a century has passed. Many people believe they have identified Zodiac. Many books claim to have solved the mystery. Many films have retold the story. But to this day, no one can prove it with certainty. The true identity of Zodiac remains somewhere between fact and legend. Perhaps he died long ago. Perhaps he spent his final years living as an ordinary man. Or perhaps his name survives only because we continue talking about him. And that is what makes this case different from almost every other criminal mystery. Because sometimes the biggest mystery is not who did it. It's why the world still cannot stop thinking about him. And perhaps we never will know the final answer.